Lately, Dave Filoni, the widely beloved supervising director on the Clone Wars and many subsequent Star Wars series, has seen increasing criticism for his love of a good retcon. We've discussed a few instances where shows he's worked on have retconned or ignored old material, such as how Tales of the Jedi trampled over parts of the Ahsoka novel, and how the Bad Batch recently brought back Asajj Ventress after her death in Dark Disciple. While we have great respect for Filoni and his shows, nobody's perfect, and this sort of disregard for other creators' work is worth criticizing. But while most of this criticism has been directed at Filoni's more recent work, by far the worst offender in this regard often slips under the radar when it comes to discussions about retcons, that being Star Wars: The Clone Wars. While we have a deep love for this show, as do increasingly many fans, it's not without its issues, and one of its biggest is just how many inconsistencies it creates with other expanded universe media. This is what we'll be talking about today, the many, many continuity issues and retcons imposed by Star Wars: The Clone Wars, and why they're a problem that Star Wars has gotten increasingly worse at avoiding.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
In terms of canonicity, Star Wars: The Clone Wars is unique among Star Wars media. With the exception of its final season, it aired during the days of the old expanded universe, but while all other EU media was relegated to the Legends timeline after Disney acquired Lucasfilm, The Clone Wars was treated somewhat differently. Like the original 6 saga films, The Clone Wars is one of the few pieces of Star Wars media that's both Legends and canon, except for the final season, which is exclusively canon. Within the canon timeline, The Clone Wars doesn't cause all that many issues, which makes sense, since it predates the entirety of the canon EU, and thus everything else has been built around it. But in Legends, The Clone Wars made a hell of a mess, one that was never properly cleaned up. Before we get into that though, a quick disclaimer. We're not here to make you mad at Star Wars: The Clone Wars, Dave Filoni, or anything else. We're just here to share some trivia and comment on an unfortunate trend in Star Wars storytelling. We're not hating on anyone or anything, nor do we encourage you to go hate on anyone or anything we mention in this video. Please keep the comments on this one civil, and with that out of the way, let's get into it. The Clone Wars created its biggest continuity issue right at the beginning, when its very existence completely messed up the entire timeline of the Clone Wars that had existed up until that point. Most Clone Wars era stories put out before the show started airing were part of the original Clone Wars multimedia project, which churned out a slew of books, games, comics, and most famously, a cartoon between the releases of Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. Authors working on this project collaborated with one another, telling stories that cross-referenced each other across mediums to build up a sense of continuity. Perhaps the coolest part of the project was that, since it was taking place over the course of 3 years, it told the stories of the Clone Wars more or less in real time, with stories often set at a point in the war that corresponded with how long after Attack of the Clones they were released. The most well-known element of this project was the original Star Wars Clone Wars microseries, but there were also 7 novels, 4 short stories, 4 video games, a ton of comics, and even a news segment in Star Wars Insider, which reported on different battles of the conflict from loyalist and separatist perspectives. Because most of the Clone Wars era stories were released as part of this project, and because of the extensive coordination that went into it, the Clone Wars era originally had the most organized and well-defined timeline of any part of the expanded universe. Every Clone Wars story was dated not just by the year, but by the exact month. The first season of the microseries, for instance, took place 4 months into the war, while the introduction of Phase 2 armor in Star Wars Republic 68 was dated to month 24, and Anakin Skywalker's knighting in the microseries' second season was dated to month 30, 6 months before the events of Revenge of the Sith. It was the most fleshed out and well-organized timeline any era of Star Wars has ever had, in both Legends and canon. Then, the Clone Wars happened. Unlike most prior Clone Wars era stories, the series wasn't precisely dated, but it starts early in the war. The opening crawl of the film implies it doesn't take place all that long after the Battle of Geonosis. The tie-in novel, Wild Space, dates the Battle of Christosis, which opens the film to a mere 7 weeks into the war. Despite all of this, however, Anakin Skywalker is shown to be a knight from the start of this series, which throws the entire timeline we just discussed into chaos. As we said earlier, Anakin Skywalker was originally knighted 30 months into the war at the start of the Outer Rim sieges. Consequently, most existing Clone Wars stories that involved Anakin had him as still being Obi-Wan's Padawan. All of these stories must therefore take place before the start of the Clone Wars, compacting what was previously 2.5 years worth of stories into a year at most and 7 weeks at the least. This doesn't just affect stories that involve Anakin either. Because the Clone Wars multimedia project was so cross-referential, this retcon compacts virtually the entire timeline of the war into that small period of time between the Battle of Geonosis and the start of the show. That's only the start of the problems this causes too. The reordering in the timeline introduces new inconsistencies into the use of certain technologies. In the original timeline, for instance, Anakin is shown flying a late war-style Jedi Interceptor right after his knighting in the micro-series, clones begin using Phase 2 armor while Anakin was still a Padawan, and the Venator-class Star Destroyer is a late war addition to the Republic arsenal, first deployed months after the introduction of the Victory-class Star Destroyer in 20 BBY. It all snowballs, and the result is one massive continuity snarl, especially if the dating of the Battle of Christosis from Wild Space is taken into account. Some stories also just don't fit into the new timeline created by the show. Consider the Dreadnoughts of Rendili arc from Star Wars Republic, which details Anakin's first mission after his ascension to Jedi Knight. This arc doesn't fit before the show in the timeline, since it prominently features clone troopers in Phase 2 armor and involves the apparent death of Asajj Ventress, who Anakin throws into the bowels of Coruscant after a lightsaber duel. Ventress is later revealed to have survived this in Star Wars Obsession, but only with cybernetic reconstruction, which she lacks in Star Wars The Clone Wars. However, Dreadnoughts of Rendili doesn't fit after the Clone Wars in the timeline either, because it's in the aforementioned duel with Ventress that Anakin gets a burn scar over his right eye, a scar he's shown to already have at the start of Star Wars The Clone Wars. To make matters even more confusing, supplementary materials for The Clone Wars reference Dreadnoughts of Rendili, citing Anakin and Ventress's duel as the source of that scar. Given how utterly incompatible parts of The Clone Wars are with the Legends timeline, you might be wondering why The Clone Wars wasn't just shunted off to canon, allowing the Legends timeline to be restored to how it was before the show began airing. The reason is that when The Clone Wars was being aired, it was being aired as part of that old expanded universe, and its events were referenced by other EU sources. The show had its own multimedia project, which saw the release of 9 novels, including the aforementioned Wild Space, as well as comic series and games, all of which are exclusively Legends. Non-Clone Wars era stories released during the show's run also referenced it, sometimes quite heavily. Some of the Legacy era novels, for instance, were based on the Mortis mythology introduced in the show's 3rd season. The Clone Wars is thoroughly enmeshed in Legends, but it still doesn't fit in the timeline. When the show was airing, the powers that be at Lucasfilm promised that when the show was complete, a more definitive timeline of all Clone Wars era stories would be made. However, after the show was cancelled and all the sources in conflict with it were relegated to the Legends continuity, this promise was abandoned and the Clone Wars mess was never cleaned up. At this point, it probably never will be. The timeline issues introduced by Star Wars The Clone Wars were the first and most impactful set of inconsistencies the show's introduced, but they were not the last. Episodes of the show frequently trampled over other expanded universe stories, sometimes for no apparent reason. In some cases, these inconsistencies were small and either insignificant or easy to retcon away. For instance, when the name of the planet Korriban was changed to Moraband in the show's 6th season, it was quickly clarified that Moraband was a little used alternate name and that the original name wasn't being erased. Other inconsistencies were more impactful. We'll start by looking at inconsistencies in world building, which the Clone Wars often fell prey to. The show frequently featured planets and cultures that originated in EU sources. However, it didn't always depict them very accurately. The most well-known example of this was how the show treated Mandalorians, which Karen Traviss, the EU author who had established much of the lore surrounding the Mandalorians, considered so egregious that she quit Star Wars writing altogether in protest of it. Traviss's Clone Wars era novels, as well as many other EU sources, depicted Mandalore as a lush jungle world with a decentralized, overwhelmingly rural, and somewhat low-tech Mandalorian population who lived traditional lives in an almost anarchistic society based on the ancient Mandalorian clans. The Mandalorian warrior codes were still the dominant feature of Mandalorian society, though proper Mandalorian warriors were rare after the Mandalorian Civil War between the true Mandalorians and the Death Watch. The Mandalorians were given a language, complex and detailed cultural traditions, and an enormous amount of lore about how they lived their daily lives. Not only did the Clone Wars disregard all of it, but it went in the exact opposite direction from what Traviss had established. It depicted Mandalore as a radioactive white sand desert, with the Mandalorian population concentrated into densely packed, high-tech dome cities where they lived under the rule of a duchess. Worse, these Mandalorians were pacifists, having forsaken their warrior codes long ago. The surviving Mandalorians were said to have been driven into exile on Mandalore's moon, Concordia, where they died out long ago. Virtually every detail of Mandalore and Mandalorian society is the opposite of what all prior sources had established. This was mitigated somewhat by subsequent retcons. Later sources clarified that only parts of Mandalore had been bombed into desert, and that the new Mandalorians were only one sect of Mandalorian society, and that everything that had been established about the planet still applied to the rest. All the same though, the Clone Wars struck out so far from the established lore that it was understandably considered disrespectful by other Star Wars authors. Mandalore was the worst example of the Clone Wars screwing with the EU's world building, but it wasn't the only example. Ryloth's depiction in the show's first season conflicts with established sources in a very major way, namely in that it's shown to have an ordinary day-night cycle, despite 30 years of sources stating the planet was tidally locked. The show took one of the expanded universe's most fascinating planet concepts, a world where the Twi'leks eked out a perilous existence in a narrow twilight band between a scorching wasteland on one side and a frigid, permanently dark jungle on the other, and made it into a rather unremarkable planet, little more than Tatooine with Twi'leks. In the first season, the show also depicted Bothawui as a gas giant instead of a terrestrial planet for some reason, though later sources retconned this into being another planet in the Bothawui system. The Night Sisters of Dathomir, who were introduced in the 90s EU novel The Courtship of Princess Leia, also saw substantial changes. Whereas the original novel depicts the Night Sisters as the dark side renegade faction of the Witches of Dathomir, most of whom were light side aligned, the Clone Wars implies the Night Sisters to be the only witches on Dathomir, though it never says this outright, fortunately. The Witches' most well-known cultural trait, which was bonding with and riding Dathomir's native Rancors, was absent from the show, as were the Rancors themselves. Instead, the Night Sisters, who were previously just the descendants of Jedi heretics with ordinary Force powers, were given all sorts of new magic abilities, the products of an aspect of the Force only they could access. The Dathomir changes are far less egregious because they're cool as hell and don't necessarily exclude the possibility of other Night Sister clans with different traditions, but all the same, it's an example of the Clone Wars' somewhat bizarre tendency to take concepts that originated in the EU, make them into something completely different, and then overwrite the original material instead of just implementing them as new concepts. This is a tendency that shows up in other Filoni projects as well, most confusingly in Tales of the Jedi, which not only shares its name with a completely unrelated EU comic series, but that also used the same logo as said comic series for some reason. Another example of this tendency was Onderon, a planet that originated in the expanded universe and was central to the Dark Empire and Tales of the Jedi comics. Onderon was the setting of a 4-episode arc in the Clone Wars' 5th season, and to the show's credit, it actually does a much better job at making Onderon actually feel like Onderon instead of a new planet with an old name. The basic concept of a jungle planet with dangerous native beasts, where most of the people lived in the walled-off city of Aziz, is still present, though Aziz is far tinier than it should be. The Onderon rebels living in the wilderness even ride some of the native beasts, like the Beast Riders of yore, and in a surprising and very minor bit of continuity, the Onderon military uses the same uniform colors from KOTOR 2, albeit in a new style, since it's 4,000 years later. All the same, there are differences. The Onderonian jungles aren't nearly as dangerous as they were in prior sources. Aziz is far tinier than it was shown to be previously, and the iconic royal palace was replaced with the smaller and lamer Unifar Temple. Speaking of things the Clone Wars lifted from the expanded universe and then completely changed, it actually did this with a few entire story arcs. Some of the show's story arcs were clearly reimaginings of arcs from older Clone Wars stories, most notably the battles of Kamino and Mon Calamari, though these were stated to be separate battles that just occurred on the same planet. Then there's Season 4's Slaves of the Republic story arc, which was not only based on an EU story, but which overwrote its original source material entirely. Slaves of the Republic was originally a short comic series released, ironically enough, as one of the first entries in the show's own multimedia project. During the Clone Wars' 4th season, however, the comic series was straight up adapted into a 4-episode arc, and the original comics were rendered non-canon. In broad strokes, the show's arc was pretty faithful to the comics, and most of the changes were of minor details, such as the Separatist Council no longer showing up to the grand auction on Zygeria, and Ahsoka originally having disguised herself as a kidnapped Togruta princess rather than just Anakin's servant. There were a few more major changes though. Notably, Asajj Ventress was heavily involved in the original version of the story and was written out entirely, and the story's place in the timeline changed, moved up from being concurrent with the show's 1st season to being concurrent with its 4th. In later seasons especially, the Clone Wars developed a nasty habit of altering characters' stories in ways that conflicted with existing material, such as by killing them off before they were previously slated to die. This sort of thing couldn't be retconned away as easily as most of the other consistencies the show created, and it rendered parts of existing materials non-canon as a result. For example, consider the case of Evan Peel. Peel's fate in the Clone Wars is left somewhat ambiguous in the films, as he makes no appearances in Revenge of the Sith, and his seat on the Jedi Council is left empty until it's taken by Anakin Skywalker. As it does, the EU originally filled in the gaps. Peel's actions during the Clone Wars were depicted in the Clone Wars microseries, and his fate was revealed in the novel Coruscant Nights 1, Jedi Twilight. The novel has him survive the events of Revenge of the Sith and escape the fall of the Jedi Temple during the opening hours of the Great Jedi Purge, only to be hunted down and killed by stormtroopers a few months later. Just 3 years after Coruscant Nights 1 came out, however, the Clone Wars completely ignored this original version of Peel's fate and killed him off in Season 3's Citadel arc. The show did something similar with Adi Gallia. Gallia was originally killed in the 5th and final issue of the comic microseries Star Wars Obsession, which shows her being gutted by General Grievous in the Battle of Boz Pity. However, the Clone Wars overwrote this death too, instead of having her die at the hands of Savage Opress on Florim. This retcon not only undermines one of Star Wars' best comic arcs, but also continues the trend of the Clone Wars doing General Grievous dirty, this time by stealing one of his highest profile Jedi kills. The Clone Wars nearly overwrote the entirety of Star Wars Obsession with its treatment of Asajj Ventress, but we'll get to that later. Barriss Offee was yet another Jedi whose fate was altered by the show. Unlike the likes of Evan Peel, Barriss Offee's time in the Clone Wars was pretty well documented by the EU, as she's the central character of the Medstar duology, a fantastic and highly underrated pair of novels that detail her work as a Jedi healer during one of the war's bloodiest battles. At the end of the duology, Offee is made a Jedi Knight, and the comic series Reversal of Fortune shows that she took a Padawan of her own, the Solonian Jedi Zonda. Reversal of Fortune shows her and Zonda playing a major role in the Battle of Felucia at the end of the Clone Wars, working alongside Aayla Secura to defeat Commerce Guild forces on the planet. Reversal of Fortune also depicts Offee being shelled by her own ATTEs and killed during Order 66, a scene that also appears in the Revenge of the Sith comic adaptation. As some of you may know, this is an adaptation of a deleted scene from Revenge of the Sith, which was originally supposed to feature Offie in the Order 66 sequence. Then, the Clone Wars overturns a lot of this by having Barriss Offee fall to the dark side and turn her back on the Jedi Order. It doesn't necessarily interfere with the Med-Star duology, since the show doesn't explicitly state or even really suggest that Offee is still a Padawan at the time of the Jedi Temple bombing. In fact, as Luminara Unduli is rather conspicuously absent from this arc, it's not a stretch at all to say that Barriss could have been made Jedi Knight before the events of Season 5. However, Offee's fall does interfere with Reversal of Fortune and the Revenge of the Sith comic, overriding her death and her training of Zonda. On their own, none of these retcons are the end of the world. However, it's part of a frustrating pattern of the Clone Wars and other Star Wars series trampling over other forms of Star Wars media for no real reason. None of these retcons were necessary. The only one that even serves a purpose to the story is Barriss Offee's fall to the dark side. Adi Gallia, in particular, was killed seemingly on a whim, and the Clone Wars' interference in characters' fates isn't limited to killing off characters, it brings them back from the dead too. The first example of this was the resurrection of Eeth Koth for the Clone Wars' second season. Originally, Eeth Koth was stated to have died in the Battle of Geonosis. Supplementary materials for Attack of the Clones establish him as having been one of the Jedi on an LAAT gunship we see get shot down in the film. Other EU sources respected these supplementary materials and made reference to Koth's death, but the Clone Wars decided to resurrect him. Not only was this, again, entirely unnecessary, as pretty much any other Jedi Master could have taken Koth's place in grievous intrigue, but it also causes additional problems, as it left Koth's ultimate fate open-ended, since Koth was never killed off in the Clone Wars, and he doesn't appear in other stories set in the Clone Wars era or later. The show could have fixed its own mess by subbing Koth in for Adi Gallia in Season 5's opener, but it just couldn't miss an opportunity to trample over Obsession, I guess. There's also the case of former Supreme Chancellor Finis Valorum. Valorum only made a brief appearance in the Clone Wars, showing up in the 6th season, but his appearance in the show doesn't fit well into the existing timeline, as Star Wars Republic shows Valorum being killed a year into the Clone Wars. Republic shows an embittered, politically ostracized Valorum becoming one of the first people to begin suspecting Palpatine of ulterior motives. In the comics, he meets with Bail Organa to share his suspicions that Palpatine is taking advantage of the war to consolidate power for himself, which inspires Organa to lead the opposition to a new Draconian Security Act. Palpatine catches wind of this conversation, however, and orchestrates a terrorist attack that destroys a passenger liner Valorum is traveling on. This not only kills the former Supreme Chancellor and many others, but the attack is also used by Palpatine as an example of why the new Security Act is necessary, leading to its passage. The Clone Wars doesn't explicitly say that this didn't happen, but as Valorum's death was originally dated to 21 BBY before the introduction of Phase 2 armor, and Valorum's appearance in the show is dated to late 20 BBY, well after the introduction of Phase 2 armor, the two sources don't exactly play well together. Apart from the initial timeline shenanigans, perhaps the most egregious example of the Clone Wars creating inconsistencies were all the alterations it made to the story of Asajj Ventress. Ventress was originally introduced in the expanded universe, and she was a major antagonist of the original Clone Wars multimedia project, appearing extensively in the micro-series, the novels, and especially the comics. She made her first appearance in the one-shot comic Jedi Mace Windu, and was more properly introduced in the Star Wars Republic arc, The New Face of War. Later issues of Star Wars Republic gave her a detailed backstory, while the aforementioned Star Wars Obsession comics gave her story a fitting conclusion. Asajj Ventress was a character that really belonged to the Dark Horse comics team, particularly Harden Blackman, who had written most of her appearances in Star Wars Republic, including the issue that revealed Ventress's backstory, and who had written Star Wars Obsession with the goal of giving her character a fitting end. He and the rest of the Dark Horse team were responsible for Ventress's characterization and most of her story, and Obsession in particular was a passion project on their part, a tribute to a character they had put so much work into shaping. All that makes what the Clone Wars did with her character not only infuriating, but disrespectful. Asajj Ventress was the most prominent expanded universe character to join the main recurring cast of the Clone Wars, and at first, the show treated her pretty well. Timeline snarls aside, the show's depiction of Ventress lined up pretty well with Ventress's characterization in the comics. She was a little more two-dimensional, but that also goes for a number of other antagonists in that show. The Season 3 episode, Night Sisters, however, rewrote Ventress's character entirely. The episode saw Count Dooku betray an attempt to kill Ventress, leading to her leaving the Separatist cause and setting out on a campaign of revenge, conflicting heavily with her later EU appearances. Originally, as we mentioned much earlier, Ventress was presumed dead after her duel with Anakin Skywalker on Coruscant, but Obi-Wan Kenobi remained unconvinced that she was actually dead, and Star Wars' obsession sees him track her down across the galaxy. She's revealed to have survived her duel with Anakin thanks to cybernetic reconstruction at a Separatist base on Boz Pity, which the Jedi storm in the comics' final issue. Separatist forces on Boz Pity are ultimately driven into retreat, and Count Dooku orders all Separatist forces to evacuate. Ventress is unable to make it to the evacuation ships in time, however, and Dooku, unwilling to let the Jedi capture her, orders a droid sniper to kill her. Ventress is mortally wounded, and she apparently dies in Obi-Wan's arms. The very end of the issue reveals that she survived via a Sith meditation trance, however, and after she awakens, she commandeers the Republic medical transport her body was stored on, ordering the pilots to take her as far from the war, as far from galactic civilization as possible. All of this, of course, conflicts with Ventress rejecting the Separatist cause and being betrayed by Dooku much earlier in the war. Night Sisters also gave viewers a look at Ventress's backstory, a backstory that was wholesale lifted from the Republic comics, but with alterations to retcon Ventress as a Dathomirian Night Sister. According to her original Star Wars Republic backstory, Ventress was a Ratataki whose parents were killed by the armies of the warlord Osika Kurske, one of the many warlords whose armies ravaged Ratatak. The orphaned Ventress was adopted by the wayward Jedi Kai Narek, who had crash-landed on Ratatak and took Ventress as his apprentice. Together, Narek and Ventress battled the warlords in an attempt to bring peace to the war-torn planet, but Kurske was able to convince the other warlords to ally with him against the Jedi, and their armies eventually killed Kai Narek. An enraged Ventress swore an oath of vengeance, which she fulfilled by tracking down and murdering the 12 warlords whose forces had been present that day. For each warlord slain, she added a tattoo to her head, and when the warlords were all destroyed, Ventress claimed rule of the entire planet, becoming the Queen of Ratatak. The episode Night Sisters preserves pretty much all of this backstory, though it only depicts quick flashes of it, with one notable exception. It retcons Ventress as having been born on Dathomir and given away to slavers as a young child. Her parents were retconned to have been her owners, and the rest of the story proceeded the same from there. This was the last time the Clone Wars respected virtually any element of Ventress's original story and characterization. With each subsequent arc involving Ventress, she moved further and further away from her characterization in Star Wars obsession. The show's writers had planned to ultimately kill Ventress off in the second of 2 story arcs, later adapted into the novel Dark Disciple, which would have overwritten obsession altogether. Ventress's case most clearly illustrates why the casual way in which these shows will retcon EU sources is an issue. The Clone Wars took someone else's character, taking advantage of their work in creating, characterizing, and fleshing out said character, and then completely overwrote part of that original source material. It's one thing to just ignore EU stories to do your own thing, continuity errors be damned. It's another thing entirely to overwrite a source that you're drawing on for your own story. Now, Star Wars, The Clone Wars, and Dave Filoni's other shows aren't the only pieces of Star Wars media to overwrite old sources and cause continuity errors and retcons. The Star Wars expanded universe has always had its fair share of retcons and messy continuity, though it should be said that Star Wars has always been way better than most franchises' expanded universes in this regard, and outside of a few trouble spots, Star Wars Legends in particular is a lot more internally consistent than it's often given credit for. Nonetheless, this is unfortunately a declining trend. The new canon has quickly amassed a whole pile of retcons and bad continuity of its own. to the point where it's honestly worse at continuity than Legends ever was at this point. This isn't helped at all, of course, by series like Tales of the Jedi and The Bad Batch deciding to treat the novels and comics as lesser forms of Star Wars media, despite them all being just as canon under the new system. The way canonicity is handled in canon makes things worse. In the days of the old expanded universe, there were different tiers of canon that dictated which kind of source took priority when in conflict with another. The films and word of George Lucas, or G-canon, was ranked at the top and superseded everything below it, most of which was considered C-canon, which included most of the expanded universe. The Clone Wars actually got its own category, T-canon, which ranked between the two, above C-canon but below G-canon, which meant that whenever the Clone Wars came into conflict with the EU, the show always took priority. This system was done away with under the new canon, which holds all EU sources, from the shows to the novels, to be equally canon. However, the shows have kept trampling all over other kinds of EU media anyway, and Lucasfilm seems to have adopted a policy of just having the most recent source take priority. Continuity problems aside though, the way the Clone Wars and its successors have treated the expanded universe material they draw from is disrespectful to the authors of the original work. The novels, comics, and all the rest are creative works in their own right, and their creators put as much passion and effort into them as the crews of the shows and movies put into their creations. The less popular forms of Star Wars media aren't just there for the more prominent pieces of Star Wars media to take concepts from and then erase. Far too many Star Wars shows have treated the rest of the EU that way, and we'd like nothing more than to see this trend stop. So that's our look at the many continuity snarls inflicted by Star Wars The Clone Wars. But what do you think? Were you unaware of any of these retcons? Do you think that any of these retcons improved the story overall? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.